Hello and welcome back for another VMK in the C++ series. In this VMK, I'll be discussing the differences between using the post increment operator and using the pre-increment operator. Let's jump into Visual Studio and take a look. So let's say we start off with an integer that has a value of 5. And I want to set the value of j equal to I++. If I were to run this code, I'll put a breakpoint right here at the end, and that way we can analyze what's going on here. So the value of I is equal to 6 because we basically said it starts off at 5. We're going to increment it, so obviously I should be 6. However, the value of j is still equal to 5. So post increment means that the value that I get saved here inside of j is the value before the incrementing happened. So in other words, it's still equal to 5. We assign the value to j to be 5, and then after that we increment the value of I to be the next value, which is 6, and then we return out. So now if I change this up to be ++I and rerun the code, notice what we get now. I is still equal to 6, but now j is equal to 6 as well. So what's happening here is we initialized the I value to be 5. We pre-incremented it, so we changed it to 6, and then we saved it to the value of j, and then we return out. So that's the main difference here between ++I and I++. If we have ++I, we're actually incrementing, then saving. If we have I++, we're saving, and then we're incrementing. So there's a different operation order here that happens. However, when we're doing this inside of a for loop, because typically you'll see this used like this, where we have for int I is equal to 0, I is less than some value, let's say 6, and then we have I++. This can actually give you a little bit of a problem. You may not realize, but you're actually creating copies of your variables here for no apparent reason. You're not using them for anything, but you are actually making a copy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class to actually demonstrate very clearly the downfalls of using I++ versus ++I. So I'm going to create a new class. I'll just call it my class, I guess. And inside of this class, I'll be creating a constructor where we can actually assign a ID to it so we can keep track of how many times we construct this same object. I'm going to go inside of the header file here and modify this code to look like the following. We're going to have a value stored inside of this class. I'm going to have a static integer which is going to keep track of which object this my class object is. And that's going to get stored here inside of the ID value. And finally, there's going to be a static integer. I just chose to stick it inside of this class, and I'm going to initialize it to 10. So this is how many loops we're going to be doing inside of our for loop. I have a single parameter constructor, which is going to take in a value, destructor, and a static function here that returns to us the number of loops. So that's going to be this value here. And then we're going to have the ++ operator and the operator ++. Notice the definition here. For the ++ operator, this is the prefix operator, you need to return a address to my class, and it has no parameter passed in. Whereas the postfix operator takes in a integer value, and it's going to return to us not an address, but actually a copy of a my class object. So having that definition here, let's go into the myclass.cpp file and take a look at the implementation of each of those functions. First we have the constructor. It takes in an integer, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to increment our counter value by 1, store that inside of the ID value, and take the I value, which is the value passed in, and store it inside of our member variable called I value. Actually, I'll put this over onto the side here so we can compare. So the counter here is going to get stored inside of ID, and the I value that we pass in here is getting stored inside of I value. I'm going to print off a message saying we're constructing this guy here. Then we have our destructor. So all I'm going to do here is call destroy and pass in the value so we can see which one of our objects we're destroying. Then we have our prefix operator. So this guy here, we don't pass in any parameter, but what we want to do is take the I value, which we have stored, and just increment it by 1. So I'm going to prefix increment it. We could also do other things here if we have other objects within the class, but we don't. So I'm just putting in a comment here. And then we want to return the address of ourselves, so we can do that by returning the value of this. For the postfix operator, we pass in an integer value, but we don't actually use that. What we do is we first need to make a copy of ourselves. So we need to know what is our current value. So that's going to get stored here inside of my class. Then we call the prefix operator, which is this one up here, to actually increment ourselves. And then we go and return the copy which we previously saved before we did this increment value. So this is where we create another copy because we actually have to return back out a myClass object, which is then stored inside of your code wherever you're using it. And then finally we have our get number of loops, which basically just is going to display get number of loops and then the actual number of loops that we have inside of our member variable. To actually perform this copy here, we need to have our copy constructor defined. So here's our copy constructor. We're passing in a myClass object. We're going to take the counter that we have inside of the static member variable, incremented by 1, stored inside of the ID, and also take the value that's stored inside of this class that we're passing in, and just copying it over to our new class's constructor that we're constructing for this object. Finally, I'm going to print a message here saying that we're copy constructing this guy from this other guy here. So let's try building myClass.cpp. And then going into looping.cpp, we'll include myClass.h. So now let's take a look at how we can use myClass inside of a for loop. Oh, I should mention here that our goal is to basically loop this myClass object this number of times inside of the for loop. So we can do that by using this code here. So I'm going to create a I value just to keep track of which loop we're currently on, and that's going to get printed here inside of this print statement. So we have loop and then the actual number that we're going to be incrementing here. Inside of the for loop, we're going to initialize our class to some value, initially 0. Then we're going to check to see whether our current value is less than the number of loops that we need to do. And if it is, we'll go through here, print this message off, and then we're going to use the post increment operator on our class to increment that I value and then continue on through. So let's run this code and take a look at the output. Notice that we ran through that loop 10 times. But yet, if we analyze here, we see we needed to create 21 objects to increment through that loop. So what's going on here? Well, let's take a look step by step. We construct one, which is the very first one here. We call get number of loops right here, and then we go and print loop number 1. Then we go inside of this a post increment operator where we construct 2 from 1. And then we return that copy, so we construct 3 from 2. But then we don't need them, so we destroy 2 and we destroy 3. Then again, we go back inside of here to check to see how many loops we have left to do. So we get number of loops. And then since we do need to go further, we print out number 2 and continue. So now we construct 4 from 1, construct 5 from 4, and then destroy all of those. So notice we have all these extra constructions and destructions all because of this post increment operator. This is no good. Now let's take a look at what would happen if we were just to change that post increment operator to a prefix operator like so. The code is going to run exactly the same. Still, it's going to loop 10 times through the for loop, but now let's take a look at how many times we create objects and destroy them. So I'm going to build and run, and now take a look. We constructed one object, which is this first object here, and then we call number of loops. We have loop number 1, number of loops, loop number 2, and so on, and then we destroy one object. So all in all, by making that one change, we've basically eliminated having to make all these extra copies of our object when they're really not needed. So I hope you realize here, when you're using the postfix operator, you are going to be making copies. There's no way of getting around it. To be able to post increment anything, you need to be able to make a copy so that you reserve the current value, increment your cells, and then return that copy that you just created. It's the only way you can do that operation. However, if you're using a prefix increment operator, you do not need to make a copy. You're actually operating directly on your object. And this saves a lot of processing time and a lot of memory. So just remember, if you're ever trying to make a choice whether you should use prefix or postfix operators, if you're going for speed and efficiency, you do want to always try to use the prefix operator. There is one other optimization that you could do here, which is to get rid of all these extra calls to get the number of loops. Instead of calling them 10 times, because that's how many times you're going to go through your loop, what you could do is create a variable, the number of loops that you're going to be calling, take that on the outside of your for loop, like so, and then use that variable right here. What this is going to do is it basically diverts the number of calls that you have to make into your class to get the total number of loops. So now you can see we construct one, we loop 10 times, and then we destroy one. You don't have to call this guy 10 times. So if this call here happens to be very time consuming to figure out what it is that you are actually comparing with, it may be optimal to only call it once and put it on the outside. The other thing that you could do to speed things up, and this one is a little bit up in the air in my mind. I'm not quite sure if it is more efficient to do this or not, but if the order in which you loop through your objects doesn't matter, then it is recommended to loop through them in the reversed order. And the reason why that should be more efficient is because the operation here to check to see whether your value is less than an arbitrary number could be more expensive than checking to see if your value is greater than or equal to 0. So let me demonstrate here. If I were to rewrite this for loop like this, you basically start at the very end, so number of loops minus 1, and you check to see whether your value is greater than or equal to 0 as opposed to some arbitrary number of loop value. And then instead of going up by 1 every time, you should go down by 1 every time since you're starting at the very end. So to implement this, though, you do need to have the pre-decrement operator, which we can implement here. It's going to look basically the exact same as this guy here, but instead of doing plus plus, we're doing minus minus. So let's quickly implement that. Let's change this to a minus minus and change this to a minus minus. So if we run the code now, we can see we call get number of loops once, we construct once, loop 10 times, and then we destroy once. So that also has the benefit of only having to call get number of loops one time, and you don't need that extra variable to keep track of how many loops you have, because this part of the for loop only gets executed once, whereas this part here gets executed multiple times each time you go through your loop. So something to think about when you're doing loops, always try to use your prefix increment operators as opposed to your postfix operators so you can avoid making extra copies of your objects that you are looping through. If you have any questions about this VMK or any other VMK for that matter, head on down to the forums by clicking on the thread link beside the VMK that is of interest and post your questions there.